those who received the service after paying a bribe were more, 81%. So bribes are helping people to get services compared to those who got the service still even after refusing to pay at 29.3%. In terms of not getting the service at all, you see again the converse is true, that there were fewer people who paid the bribe and did not get the service. And there are a larger number of people who did not pay the bribe and did not get the service. So there's a very strong positive correlation between the bribe you pay and access to services.
A cultural change of our society is needed so that we see service by public servants as an opportunity to serve God, to serve Kenyans. It's not, as I said, an employment, a business for people who are serving the public. And the public should also not think that it is a transaction to pay for, but it's a demand because they pay taxes.
Well, that was this morning when a report was released by EACC basically saying hard economic times have begun to reflect in the amounts of bribes that Kenyans are forced to pay for government services. A recent survey by the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission now notes that the average bribe has dropped from 5,000 in 2017 to 3,800 in 2018. The Registrar of Persons and police in public hospitals are the top three institutions where bribery persists. By extension, the police department was perceived as the most corrupt, followed by Kenya Power and Lighting Company, the National Youth Service, the Kenya Revenue Authority, the National Council for Population Development, the Registration of Persons Department, and Kenya Defence Forces, respectively. But the report that was released today mirrors a bigger picture in Kenya on the fight against corruption. Of course, this coming just hours after the United States banned former Attorney General Amos Wako, his wife and son as well, from stepping their foot in the United States. And the question we're asking this evening on The Big Story, is there goodwill in the fight against corruption in Kenya? And we'll tell you why we're talking about this, because this is not the first time that Amos Wako actually is being banned by the US. The first time was in 2009. But the question that people are asking is there any active investigation focusing on former Attorney General Amos Wako? As we speak in Kenya, no. So where did this come from? And people are asking, perhaps it would make more sense if the US would give information, more detailed information on what exactly are the reasons why the US has banned former Attorney General why the US has banned Amos Wako from stepping foot in the United States. Let's begin this conversation with our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna, who's in our City Center studio. Sophia, there's lots of conversation about this. There are those who are already raising issues saying we need to know exactly what he's being charged with. And there are those who are asking, but why incorporate his wife and his son? So at that point, we also know that the first time he was banned in the US was in 2009. And in between his tenure as the Attorney General, he also dealt with the Golden Bag scandal and the Anglo-Leasing security contract. And people are asking, 37 years down the line, why is this coming up now?
Indeed, Linda, good evening to you. In a conversation that has elicited great debate since that report, that statement came out last evening from the State Department in the U.S. And what we now know is that the former Attorney General Amos Wako has indicated that tomorrow at around 11 a.m. he will issue a statement in this regard. Remember, even those 10 years ago when once again this happened, he did come out fighting, defending himself. And at this point, just to set the record straight, he's not being charged. It's just that they're saying they're barring him from travel because of these allegations and what they believe is involvement with alleged corruption, and saying that in this way they look to send a statement that they support the fight against corruption here in Kenya. No more indication of information of what going forward, whether there'll be more names or what this portends going forward. But we sought to speak to the ambassador, who were informed he was out of the country. And following that, we will wait to hear what Senator Wako will say tomorrow, but today that report from the EACC National Ethics and Corruption Survey 2018, conducted actually a year ago, but the results being released today, finding that Kenyans still believe corruption is the biggest challenge facing this country, and the Interior Ministry again perceived to be the most corrupt, and bribery, many Kenyans citing that to get service, public service delivered to them, they in one way or another had to pay a bribe for the same. And so to talk a little bit more about just this survey, what it means, because one of the things in the opening statement in that report by the EACC is that the reason they do these kind of surveys to aid the strategy in anti-corruption in Kenya, so to help fight graft in this country. And that has become a big issue, a topic of conversation. We've had those conversations here in the Big Story before. So I have with me Vincent Okongo. He's the Director, Preventive Services in the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. Thank you, sir, for joining us tonight here on The Big Story. First, that this was conducted a year ago. You sampled about 5,900 people in the 47 counties. Why did it take so long to get the results?
Yes, it may not have taken very long to process the survey data and provide the findings the way we did. Normally, the questionnaire we have is quite huge. It has a lot of questions touching on a number of indices and information that we require. Before we release that information, we must ensure that it is accurate, it is valid, and we work very closely with the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. And we have set this time as the key time when we release the survey findings. As we right now have just finished collecting data for the another survey report for public officers. So it is not really late. It's the timelines we have set in terms of the programs we have put in place to ensure that the survey is released at this point in time.
So this report appears to indict some, whether you like ministries or departments, year in, year out. The Ministry of Interior, Kenya Police as a department as well, making it to the top list. So reconcile for Kenyans what the point then of this report becomes, so that, fine, we know these are the leading institutions in as far as perception of corruption, but then after you've released the report, then what?
Let me say that this report looks at the two major issues. It looks at the magnitude of corruption based on actual experiences when people go around seeking services from various government agencies. Secondly, we also look at corruption perception. And when you hear leading institutions in terms of corruption-prone areas, that is perception. And thereafter, we make a raft of recommendations which should be taken up by various government agencies to ensure that they implement. Some of them include issues of enhancing corruption prevention, vetting of staff, enforcement of codes, and of course setting the tone at the top by the leadership of various institutions by developing various policies, setting structures, and developing programs that aid in the fight against corruption in those areas.
Yeah, and I see your designation, preventative services. How so? Because it's one thing to talk about fighting corruption. There's a prevention of corruption as well. So what is it you engage in and do to ensure we are not even having this problem in the first place?
Yes, as you're aware, Sophie, prevention is better than cure. And even in the fight against corruption, when you look at the UN Convention Against Corruption, in Chapter 2, we have preventive measures against corruption. And one of the key preventive measures that we have domesticated as a country and we are implementing as EACC is strengthening systems of accountability and transparency in public bodies through systems reviews and corruption risk assessment. Secondly, we also work with various partners in the civil society, private sector, faith sector, and others to play a key role in deterring the problem of corruption. We train, we build capacity of various institutions and individuals to play a key role. We create awareness among Kenyans on the fight against corruption for their effective and active engagement. So prevention is the way to go. Unfortunately, in our realm, we have seen that a lot of focus is put on enforcement, and yet we know prevention is the most sustainable approach to the fight against corruption. So This survey aids us in designing appropriate prevention measures that can help us to address the challenge of corruption at source.
So what kind of engagement would happen, for instance, now, if for the last 3 years the Ministry of Interior has been cited as the most corrupt in terms of perception? So what changes? Because again, it comes down to what then really does the benefit, the importance, this information in helping get institutions better?
One of the things we do is to bring this particular challenge to the various institutions that are affected. For example, in the Ministry of Interior and the police, in particular the police service, we have had a very serious conversation with the former IG, and we are working with the current IG, one, to carry out a systems review of the police service, to find where the loopholes are, where the weaknesses are that lead to these corrupt practices. Secondly, after looking at those systems, we are able to identify and make appropriate recommendations that we also follow through. Secondly, we want to ensure that we have integrity champions in various institutions. So through training, we also equip integrity assurance officers. We also set up corruption prevention committees to ensure that the top leadership of every institution, like now the Interior, from the CS, the PS, and the line departments, take responsibility for addressing the challenge of corruption.
Yeah. And still the point of implementation or operationalization of some of these laws and efforts are not quite in place. For instance, talk about wealth declaration forms, and it's a challenge as EACC you have had, that yes, the members of parliament will submit the same, but in terms of access and using the same to weigh the lifestyle and have a lifestyle audit, that has been a problem. The other thing is we keep talking about stepping aside if one is mentioned in corruption. Again, not cast in stone, not in law. So what in your view needs to happen so that this moves from a conversation of if you so wish to the law compels one to take certain actions?
Thank you. Within the framework of the multi-agency team, which you know is working very closely in the fight against corruption, a raft of recommendations have been made to Parliament to strengthen anti-corruption laws, particularly with regard to access to health declaration forms. As it is now, it is very difficult to access those forms. It is very laborious, it's cumbersome, and for your information, you also have to get express permission from the person whose declaration you want to see. So that is not a good way to go. So we are proposing to Parliament to ensure that law enforcement agencies, and EACC in particular, to be a competent authority, to have central authority over wealth declaration, to aid in investigation and lifestyle audits whenever they come. Yeah. So that's one area where we have strongly made a recommendation to Parliament to consider.
And this is a report from the EACC, but the entire criminal justice system, DCI, we saw the judiciary, the courts, again cited as some of the corrupt institutions. So how does this augur in as far as strengthening even the channels which are used to fight corruption?
Secondly, one of the areas we have considered in terms of recommendations to Parliament is to set up timelines within which cases can be heard and determined and disposed of, so that it strengthens the judicial and the criminal justice system for anti-corruption. The other thing we have indicated is that state officers, whenever they are being investigated or have been charged in court, should be able to step aside to facilitate. You remember the ruling by Mumbi Ngugi indicated that this is a case law aspect, but we want to see that these matters are entrenched in law so that it facilitates the work of law enforcement agencies. Yeah.
As we bring this to a close, of course, it's not a matter directly touching on EACC, but to the extent of it being a subject in the public domain, this barring and banning of the former Attorney General by the United States, and they're saying they're looking to send a strong message of their support of the anti-graft campaign in the country. How then does the EACC in this time as well come out to be seen as the owners, and this is country, home country for the residents, Kenyans, doing more again to also send a powerful statement that more is being done?
Thank you. As you're aware, the EACC and the MAT agencies have been working very closely with foreign missions to support and facilitate the war against corruption. And this has been in the public domain. The chair of the commission reiterated it this morning, and we think some of these actions that are being taken are sending a strong signal, and that is a deterrent measure in the fight against corruption. Yeah.
Okay. I will mention this before we go. I noticed that the media, in terms of the Kenyans' confidence in their participation, goes at 77%, the church at 61%. In terms of your engagement and getting the word out, because it's about information or misinformation at times, is that gearing well and auguring well with the kind of strategies you have in place?
Very well, because in the recent past, the last 2 years, we have focused on the use of media to send the message out there to Kenyans about the fight against corruption. Our key focus has been local radio stations, which most Kenyans listen to, and we can gladly say that this is giving confidence to the media as well in terms of addressing the problem of corruption.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Vincent Okongo is the Director of Preventative Services of the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission with us this evening. So, Linda, it perhaps would interest you to note of that 77% confidence, a large portion of it, as Mr. Okongo mentions, goes to radio, 62%. So television, about 25% of that confidence in helping get this information out. But back to that report on the former Attorney General, definitely Kenyans looking to hear what he'll have to say, but also to set the record straight. There has been this report or letter on the social media circulating heavily, purportedly from the BBI team secretariat seeking to defend Amos Wako. I have spoken to the co-convener, that's Paul Mwangi, and he says that's fake, so that what it purports to do to say that they defend him, he continues to be the chair of the committee, and that he's never been charged in Kenya. They have not issued any report or statement in regards to that matter, Linda.
Yeah, Sophia, thank you. I was actually looking at that purported press release that was released by BBI. I also did call Ambassador Martin Kimani, and he said, we have not released any statement of that kind. So lots of fake news doing rounds. But I like what your guest says, that they're working very closely with foreign nations to fight corruption. And that is where I want to pick this next conversation, because you've talked about the issue of corruption in Kenya, and that report that was released by EACC this morning. I want to widen that conversation and look at that communique by Michael Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State, touching on former Attorney General Amos Wako, who has now been banned from setting foot in the United States alongside his wife and his son as well. Let's listen in to what residents of Busia had to say when this news came out.
Amekuwa the longest serving AG in the country. Hatuelewi hii makosa alikuwa ameifunika wapi, ndiposa wakati ametoka sasa ako kama senator, ndio sawa wanasema kwamba amekuwa na scandal. Hatuelewi, ni siasa tu. Ufisadi umengoja wakati ametoka, amekuwa attorney general ndio ukajipuka. Yule ambaye anasema kwamba yeye ni mfisadi alikuwa wapi kutoa that evidence wakati alipokuwa akiwa attorney general? Ama ufisadi ameanza akiwa senator?
Naona kwamba ni shida ya Trump. Unajua Trump hako na shida na Afrika. Ndio naona anasema na deport wa Afrika, hiyo ndio shida iko tu. Lakini kusema kwamba senator amehusika kwa jambo lolote, hana shida yoyote, hana jambo lolote, hana ufisadi.
Haya, Trump wako na shida na Afrika. Hii shida imetoka na huko. All right, let's have a conversation about this. We're speaking to Elisha Ngoya, who's a lawyer. He's joining us from Kabarak University in Nakuru. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us on The Big Story this evening. In a couple of minutes, I will be speaking to Dr. Jack Mwimwali as well, who's a law lecturer at Jomo Kenyatta University. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on The Big Story. Elisha, allow me to begin with you, and I want your quick reaction on the public designation of Amos Wako by the U.S. government.
Thank you so much, Linda. Very briefly, in terms of international relations and foreign relations, every country has a right as an integral part of its sovereignty to choose who to associate with. And that's why countries determine where to post their diplomatic missions and where not to post their diplomatic missions in terms of which countries they want to associate with, but also in terms of the individuals that they want to associate with. Countries declare some persons persona non grata, and if they are within their boundaries, they deport them. or if they are outside their boundaries, they refuse to admit them in their territory. And that's why before anyone travels into any country, they need a form of clearance in the form of what we call a visa document, which is the permission given to you, meaning that you have no automatic right to access any other country, but you go there as a privilege at their instance, at their pleasure. Now, countries set up particular laws and particular policies that determine how they relate to other countries and how they relate to individuals. And whereas some of this may be determined by their friendliness to other countries, a bulk of this is determined by the country's own interests. A country's primary obligation is to protect its own interests. So you will see, for example, that countries will put people on terrorism lists and say these people cannot access our country because of our own interest in security. But similarly, countries in the West now are putting people on watch lists if those people violate what they consider their values. And America, in this case, has considered corruption as one of the things that violate their values. But my observation is that a bulk of these countries in the West also look at how corruption, partly in African countries, affect their interests in the West. For instance, because of corruption in African countries, to say by way of example, a lot of immigrants run to the West in search of opportunities because corruption kills opportunities. So that strains social amenities in the West. It therefore becomes an integral part of the internal interest, the self-interest of many Western countries to prevent that strain on their amenities, to join the war in fighting corruption in many African countries in the hope that that may grow opportunities in Africa so that Africans may remain there and stop straining the amenities in the West, seeking asylum in the West, and so forth and so on. So I view this in that context.
All right, but this is we're not just speaking about anybody here on Goya. We're speaking about the former Attorney General, Republic of Kenya. And then that brings to fore, perhaps someone should have given more information on why he has been banned from stepping foot in the U.S., perhaps give specifics, full disclosure, this is why, so that we avoid a lot of speculation that is currently going on.
Well, information has been given to the extent that it is corruption related.
Okay.
Remember, this is not the first time Amos Wako is being banned from setting foot in America. In the year 2009, if my memory serves me right,
yeah,
Amos Wako was banned from setting foot in America on account of the fact that he was perceived by the American government as being anti-reform.
Yeah.
And at that point in time, the language of reform was perceived as being part and parcel of American values. So to the extent that the particulars have been supplied as being corruption-related, well, that's the particular that they have supplied. This is a former Attorney General. Yes, the nature of corruption is such that it touches more those in power, because then they are the ones with an opportunity to engage in corruption, as it were. So it should not be extremely surprising as such.
No,
what should bother us is why others out there are taking action against our officials when there is no corresponding enthusiasm locally in taking similar action against similar individuals. We saw this in the UK, where suspects in the Chicken Gate scandal
yes,
were imprisoned there when people are not prosecuted here with the same expedition. We saw this in New Jersey, where warrants of arrest were issued against Kenyan officials for engaging in corruption when the same officials are still working freely here. That, to me, should bother we as a people in terms of our commitment to this fight. But beyond that, I think, well, Americans have done their bit to the extent that that touches them, leaving the rest to Kenyans to pursue their minor details of interest.
And you see, Ongoya, that is the perception that countries out there are doing their bit. What is Kenya really doing in the fight against corruption? Like you mentioned, it should bother us that the U.S. is now banning Amos Wako. Here in Kenya, there's no single case against Amos Wako. He's not been mentioned in any corrupt dealing in the last couple of years. And you have the U.S. banning him, and you've also mentioned Chicken Gate. So then that asks, puts us in a point where we're asking, the credibility of the judicial system and indeed the investigative agencies in Kenya, that should worry Kenyans out there in the fight against corruption, shouldn't it?
Yes, the nature of the fight against corruption is that, particularly if you look at the way it's defined in our constitution, is it anticipates collective action. All and sundry involved must be involved in the fight. But if you look at conversations, particularly between the judiciary on the one hand, the investigative agencies on the other hand, the prosecutorial agencies on the other hand, and even the common Kenyan on the street, the nature of this fight is such that it's carried out as a blame game. One institution pointing fingers at another and the other pointing fingers back without any form of collegiality in the fight. I guess it's the former anti-graft czar in Kenya, Professor P.L. Lumumba, the founder dean of Kabarak University Law School, where I am at the moment, who observed that when he served at the Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission, he understood later that his brief was not to fight corruption, but to appear to be fighting corruption. An experience with the Kenyan situation reveals that he may not have been far off the mark in his diagnosis of the situation.
Okay. He was not meant to fight corruption. He was meant to appear to be fighting corruption. And I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot, Ongoya, because we have gotten to a point where there was so much goodwill with touching on the office of the DPP and the DCI with several arrests of high-profile individuals. But then that goodwill is slowly fading away. And Kenyans are saying, we've seen high-profile arrests. We've seen people jumping over fences to get suspects. And then there's almost a very small percentage of prosecution in the same matter. So is Kenya really on the path, on a good path to fight corruption, or is it, as you say, we appear to be fighting corruption?
I'd not want to cast unnecessary aspersions on the office of the DPP and the prosecutorial agencies, but from my own experience, anytime I find people dramatizing and over-dramatizing anything, I treat it with a tinge of salt. And that is how I have treated the approach by the investigative and prosecutorial agencies so far in this country. But I give them a benefit of doubt and allow them to give me a pleasant surprise. But the drama with which they have carried out these functions gives me an opportunity to treat it with a tinge of salt. If they surprise me, I'll be pleasantly surprised.
Okay. As you wait for that surprise and as I let you go, because I know you have a class to go back to, so Amos Wako has been banned alongside his wife and his son. And there are those who say, I mean, there should be individual responsibility. Why involve his wife and his son, who probably have nothing to do with what's going on?
There is individual criminal responsibility, and what has been undertaken is not an action in the criminal justice infrastructure. What has been undertaken is an action in the diplomatic infrastructure, where they are using diplomatic muscle to make their contribution to the war against corruption. And sometimes when you use diplomatic muscles, you not only target those who participate in the actual acts, but also those whom you perceive as their accomplices and participants. As rightly pointed out, we haven't received minute details on what they have on Amos Wako and therefore his wife and children, but I guess from my own perception, it was meant to send a message and to press where it pinches the most. When you touch the immediate family, I think the effect is likely to be felt. That's my perception of what the American government has done.
I hear you. Elisha Ngoya, thank you. Speaking to us live from Kabarak University. Thank you so much. I know you have a class to go back to. I'm taking our first break here on The Big Story. When we come back, we'll speak to Dr. Jack Mwimali, who's the law lecturer at JKUAT. So let's take our first break. We'll be back, and it's important to mention also that Amos Wako will have a presser tomorrow, and we'll cover that for you as well. Let's take that break now.